No, it's good questions. You thought about those and you brought out. You got me to talk about the stuff I like talking about. So that's great. Yeah,
That's
well
good.
done.
That's good. Okay. Listen, have a great day. Thank you very much.
Mind yourself, William. Take
You
care.
too.
All right.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 175 for the 12th of September 2024. There is a pattern, I suppose it's so well known that it's a cliche, of people mellowing their views as they get older. One version is the famous quote, I think wrongly attributed to Churchill. He said, or he didn't say, if you're not a liberal when you're 25, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative when you're 35, you have no brain. But I think that isn't exactly the effect in reality. Regardless of your political views, as you get older, life's complications present themselves, so it's harder not to take account of them and acknowledge that there are many exceptions that don't fit the more strident views you might have on any topic. Nuance is important. You might be a free market capitalist and point to the explosion of wealth that it's associated with and say that everything should be governed by the market, but if you don't eventually notice that some areas of life persistently just don't respond to market forces, then you're not paying attention. Or you might be a hardline socialist and demand that the resources of society be shared fairly. But if you don't ever recognize that wealth is not a fixed quantity and that people make a better fist of increasing that quantity when they get to keep a bigger share of what they create themselves, then you end up with having the local market stall run by a committee of the party's local coordinating executive, and you have little or nothing to sell on that market stall. Now, sounds like I'm going to make a case for the centrist dad position of being somewhat moderate on everything, but not quite. George Bernard Shaw wrote, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man." This country exists because those who died that Easter tide attempted something completely impossible, absolutely hopeless, with no chance of success. But within 5 years, more of their vision had been achieved than could ever have been imagined. It's also a cliche to point out how young the American founding fathers were, but it bears repeating. Alexander Hamilton, he of the musical, was 21 years old when he signed the Declaration of Independence. James Madison was 25 at the time. Aaron Burr was 20. James Monroe, later the president, was 18. 18. My point is that if you want to achieve anything, you need to sometimes rise above the details. The arrogance and naivety of youth might serve well in that. If you're paralyzed about breaking eggs or throwing out babies, you will never manage to make an omelette or get rid of the bathwater. There are way too many aphorisms on this topic, but I hope you get my point. And I'm not ignoring all the times that revolutionaries trying the creative destruction gig got all the destruction and precious little creativity. I was thinking about all this because one listener asked me to comment on the recent Sinn Féin affordable housing plan. It's important to remember just how appalling the crisis that we are in is. We've been building probably 40,000 fewer homes than we need every year for more than a decade, so that's a deficit of 400,000 homes needed. Aside from the financial cost on people whose housing costs prices have been inflated but have actually managed to get a home, there's hundreds of thousands of people living in some poxy kip or sleeping on a friend's couch or staying with their parents until they're 40. Forced into emigration, not able to form relationships, not able to start families. It's bad. Sinn Féin's 112-page document has dense text and very detailed proposals on how to crank up housing output over the next 5 years to reach 74,000 homes per year by 2029. The average across the 5 years starting in 2025, that's less than 4 months away, the average output across the 5 years of the next DAL would be 60,000 units per year. For context, that's double the number of units built last year and treble the number built annually before that. This sort of ramp up is a huge challenge. You can't just increase building at will. There are many constraints, including the planning process, although that is often overstated, in my opinion. There are many thousands of planning permissions that are just lying idle. By far, the two biggest constraints are land hoarding and labour supply. Sinn Féin have a robust plan to bypass the land hoarders and use the big swathes of publicly owned land held by the state, local authorities, and state companies. The labour problem is harder to crack. They do have plans to bring in new building technologies, divert activity from building hotels and the like, and increase apprenticeships, but the lead-in time for most of those is much too long to give much of a return within the lifetime of the next DAL. I spoke at length to a senior Sinn Féin source about this, and there's no question that the party is aware of how big a challenge this is, and I think that the ambition of this plan is driven by the fact that the party has been deeply stung by their poor performance in the local and European elections in June, and by their failure to move the needle on the polls since. But is it a good plan? As I said, it's 112 pages long, and I honestly think that if I were to list everything in it that I disagree with, that document would be even longer than the plan, so I'm not going to bore you with all of that here. But a couple of things. One big issue I have is that a third of the total build is for rental, social rental and affordable rental. Big difference between those two, but in this context, not so important. I know that we have all heard of Vienna and Berlin, where 80 or 90% of the homes are rented, but Ireland has a huge cultural attachment to home ownership, and people want what they want. It's not a good idea to burn up your political support pushing people into a form of housing that they don't want for ideological reasons. Sinn Féin has put a lot of thought into extensive measures to try to prevent the spending splurge on their planned building blitz from being eaten up by building cost inflation. That's a good thing, but I think it's just not going to be enough. When the money supply grows faster than the supply of what's being bought, inflation is unavoidable. And the inescapable issue here is how we got into this mess in the first place. Ireland uniquely focuses its tax base on work and leaves assets tax-free, which sucks money that should be invested in productivity. It sucks that money into property speculation instead. But no politician is brave enough to tackle that. So no property tax because populism. I have some big objections. I have lots of little ones. So am I against this plan? Absolutely not. This is a politically brave move on a topic that needs political bravery. If you wait around trying to meet the concern of every gobdaw on a podcast, you will never get anything done. We should not sacrifice the good on the altar of the perfect. Housing is easily the most serious internal problem that Ireland has. It'll take a lot of revolutionary thought and a lot of nuance, but if half of this plan works, that will be a big achievement. In a moment, we'll have the interview, but first I want to say thank you to all of the patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who donates. We don't get a huge amount of money out of it. We're not in the same league as some big podcasters, but it pays for things like web hosting, and Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. It's also a great morale booster. When we get a new Patreon, we delighted to know that there's somebody out there listening and appreciating the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think that you could do the same as the other donors and throw in the price of a cup of coffee or the price of a 3-bedroom dormer made out of Lego, maybe once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
On the line, I have Professor Colin O'Gara. He is the author of a book called Gambling Addiction in Ireland, Causes, Consequences and Recovery. And Colin, you work in recovery and treatment of people with problems gambling. Tell me who you are, what you do exactly.
Okay, so Colin O'Gara is my name. I'm title as Head of Addiction Services at St. John of God Hospital in Stillorgan in Dublin. I'm also Clinical Professor of Psychiatry at UCD. And I essentially run a detox and rehab facilities and have done here at the hospital for nearly the past 20 years. So I'm a trained psychiatrist who is specialized in addiction treatment, and we treat pretty much all addictions here, both substance and non-substance, at the hospital.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I want to clear up, because I'm not 100% clear on it in my own mind, I have heard the term and the distinction of things being psychologically addictive and physically addictive. I'm presuming that gambling falls very much into the psychological addiction sphere. Can you tell me, are those two things entirely separate? What's the distinction between those two?
Oh, that's a pretty good question right off from the start. I mean, and one which you could answer many different ways.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a bit irritating, I think.
For an idiot like me, tell me the short version.
It's not. No. It's irritating. It's almost like, what's the difference between psychiatry and psychology? But no, which is a different one. But no, I mean, it's irritating because potentially irritating because of the stigma piece. We always get a little bit defensive, I think, as psychiatrists and psychologists, around the stigma that goes with mental health difficulties. I mean, essentially, gambling disorder has some physical issues. I mean, there's a paper by Mark Griffiths in the British Medical Journal in 2004 called Betting Your Life on it, and that was an introduction of the gambling disorder illness to the medical community, and it really outlined the physical gastric problems. You had physiological withdrawal states, you had physiological craving, where very, very similar to drug and alcohol dependence. And the question is an excellent one in terms of, like, where's the dividing line? I mean, gambling disorder is known as a process addiction. There isn't a substance involved, so there isn't physiological dependence to a substance. But William, I suppose the lines, that division between process and substance addiction is narrowing all the time. We see them as very much the same thing now, and that you have a lot of physical, there is no real difference, because of course we know now as well between the gut microbiome, for instance, and how our bacteria in our gut interact with our brain, and how all the systems are interlinked in many different ways. So I would put gambling addiction as both, to answer your question. So both psychologically and physically problematic.
Oh, okay. Hold on with that for a second, because some listeners may be aware, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you're the one with the qualification, not me. But for example, alcoholics, people who are addicted to alcohol, and heroin addicts in particular, to choose two specific drugs, if they don't get their drug, will have very noteworthy, very predictable physical symptoms of withdrawal that are a very clear physical ailment, because their body has adapted to taking in a relatively regular amount of that drug on a relatively regular basis. Their body has adapted to that, and quite likely, particularly possibly also with heroin, but certainly with alcohol, their body has essentially recalibrated itself to function with that amount of alcohol, and you take away that amount of alcohol and they're actually not very well able to function, literally physically. And there are other types of addiction, which you've alluded to, which relate to gambling and possibly also to, for example, smoking and other addictions. So people will talk about the distinction between, if you give up smoking, you're relatively quickly out of the physical addiction, but the psychological addiction, in other words, people have integrated into their life so deeply the process of getting a cup of coffee, going outside with the lighter, with the, and that whole process of having a cigarette. And if you take all of that away, that is difficulty, that's problematic for them. I'll get into how perhaps later. And it's very difficult for them to do all of those steps without actually having the physical part of that as well. And those two are very well integrated. Clearly, there's nothing internalized in your body when you're gambling. Like, there's no substance inserted into your body in any means in the way that a needle for heroin or a drink of alcohol or, nicotine going into your lungs. But I guess my first question, which I think you were alluding to, is, as you know the state of science and you're the person to talk about it, is it the case that there are measurable physiological changes that, if we had the right equipment, would be physically observable between people who are gamblers and gambling, gamblers and abstaining, and people who generally do not gamble? Leaving aside the problem perhaps of measurement, do those physical differences exist?
Yeah, and you've got to, well, again, this ties in with, if you look at, somebody who's suffering from a severe gambling disorder will look from, overtly well, right? So this is the problem with gambling disorder. But how do you drill down into knowing that somebody has a difficulty? So there was a good documentary recently with Paul Merson, the Arsenal football player, in it, and they did scanning studies on that documentary, and they also got him to do laboratory tests. And I think it was a Cantab test that they did, which is just a particular test that can be used, or there's a PGSI, Problem Gambling Severity Index. So there's different tests that one can do, questionnaires. Then there's lab-based tests, so you can actually do real-life gambling tests to see cases versus controls and see the deficits in risk processing. So in other words, somebody with a gambling disorder will continue to persist with the gambling in the face of adverse consequences, the obvious one being losing loads of money, and they engage in what's called chasing behavior. You can step it up another step.
Sorry, just to be clear for listeners, when you say chasing behavior, am I right in thinking that means that somebody gambles, loses, and they think, geez, I have to gamble even more in order to win back the loss of the money that I shouldn't really have gambled because it was supposed to be spent on something else? That's what you mean by chasing behavior? Absolutely,
and that's at the cutting edge, really, of big losses, where somebody might go out with the intention of gambling a certain amount of money, but then they jump onto the credit card or they get credit somehow, and it goes from there. So that chasing behavior can be very damaging. And again, you can look at chasing behavior within the next step up, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging, or if you go for an MRI of your leg, you can then get another type of MRI, which is you inject what's called a ligand or a dye into the arm, and then you go into the MRI scanner of the brain, and then you can look at the brain during what happens in particular areas when the person is in gambling task versus not. Or you can put gambling cues up onto a screen. So you can, in the case of, you can put very triggering images of, say, slots, a slot machine win, or people at a casino or whatever.
And to be clear, Colin, what you're saying is that you essentially put a tracer chemical into somebody's system, which is not harmful to them, but it can be spotted by this equipment. And
correct,
you are able to see a differential effect on the person's brain depending on whether they're looking at things that they would associate with gambling or whether they're just doing run-of-the-mill tasks, and you can spot essentially their brain lighting up when they receive information about gambling.
Well, Yeah, there's another piece of that though, is that in the chair beside is somebody who doesn't have a gambling. So it's cases versus controls, right?
So
And
that
that's
was my
then,
next question. You have a control.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
If I
yeah.
think I can be lucky to say I have very little interest in gambling. So you would essentially take somebody who might be a patient of yours, do exactly the same to me or to someone who's not so interested in gambling, and you have a measurable, observable difference in the scientific results. So it's not something.
Yes.
And you mentioned the Cantab test, which I'm not familiar with, and about a questionnaire, which is fairly typical in a lot of psychology and psychiatry, that you have a standardized set of questions. Say, do you do this? How often do you gamble? Have you gambled, I guess, with money that you should have spent on other stuff? And you add up the answers. And if a certain number of boxes are ticked, then you're able to say, this person is officially defined as a problem gambler. This process with the fMRI gets over maybe the subjective nature of that. Is that the whole theory behind that?
Yeah, correct. It's a step up in terms of being able to, I mean, the initial screening test like the PGSI to look at whether somebody falls into the criteria for a problem gambler or not, the scoring on that. So you'd have somebody who is, spending many hours a day, who've lost money, who've borrowed or stealed money to fund to continue the gambling, and you tick boxes accordingly. Now, if somebody fits that profile, then you can look at their performance in a laboratory setting in terms of particular gambling gambling games or casino style games, and look at their behaviors in terms of their ability to pull out of certain games at particular times. So obviously there's these tests are designed, again, they're not completely foolproof, but they do give an indication, just like the PGSI would. Yeah, correct. And then when you're getting into the next level then is to look, to look at somebody's live neural circuitry. And what we're looking at there is we're looking at areas of the brain like the orbitofrontal cortices or the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which are specifically associated. They're dopamine-rich areas, and they're associated with risk processing. Also reward, so risk processing and reward within these areas. And if you see, what you'll see is a deficit in the problem gambler. There will be a lack of blood perfusion in some cases to these areas versus the control. The control will have adequate perfusion, which shows that it's working. But the other part of the problem gambler will not have perfusion of that particular area because it's not working effectively. So,
okay, pause on that, because you have mentioned a couple of things that I want to make sure listeners understand. One which I definitely don't understand is TGSI. Is that a standard for judging psychological or psychiatric problems?
The PGSI, no.
PGSI, excuse me.
Yeah, Problem Gambling Severity Index. So it is a widely used screening questionnaire for problem gambling. So
understood.
So
apologies, you are far more expert on this than me. But I want to, because I have a question that I want to put to you, that I want to kind of understand on this, because I don't dispute. Obviously, you're the expert. I don't dispute anything of what you're saying. But can I ask, if, for example, somebody was very interested in model railways or racing bicycles or anything else that might be a hobby for someone that doesn't have, typically doesn't have problematic outcomes, is it likely to be the case that someone who has a great interest in quite a narrow topic that is perhaps not shared by most people, is it the case that they would get either the same or an analogous area of the brain lighting up when they saw model railways or whatever it was, and that, or is what you're describing in terms of the physical tests as opposed to the questionnaire-based tests, is that unique to, let's say, gambling or other related problematic disorders?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I don't think there's a specific area of the brain that is, certainly hasn't been identified to date that this is the gambling area of the brain and this lights up when in relation to gambling cues. I think a process like gambling it falls into the reward category. So
Sure, but no, just
there's
to pause on the question, because you mentioned, and I can't repeat them because, again, your expertise is so much better than mine, but you mentioned the areas of the brain that are noted to be affected by gambling. If I was somebody who had a great interest in some topic, no hate to the model railway people out there, but I'm just using that as an example. If I was a huge enthusiast of model railways, would I expect the same areas of my brain to be lit up when I was talking to somebody and boring the pants off them about model railways or whatever it was that was my my thing of interest?
Absolutely. But again, by the time you hit the fMRI scanner, you're really looking at people. You have done your pre-screening questionnaires, you've done your laboratory tests, and you're dealing with somebody who's specific disorder. It's pretty clear. There could be a clinical diagnosis as well. So a clinician may have seen the patient, or they may be in fact treating the patient.
Yep.
So in terms of the reward basis, would somebody who's into the model trains get a get a response in that particular area? I'm sure they probably would. But the issue here is what you're looking at specifically is you're trying to control for. So you control for many, many different confounders, okay, within your sample. Anything that may confound the result, you're looking at their level of alcohol intake, their drug intake, their model train. You're obviously not going to look at that, but again, if you feel that there was a confounder in there in terms of you might have a group of people who have a very specific interest and they may get stimulated by that. Of course, you have to. So in all of these studies, you have to screen for those confounders. But again, it's not 1v1 comparison here. The way you get into statistical significance is that you look across multiple comparisons. Okay, and the bigger the study, the better. Okay, and at the end of the day, we're looking at association. We're not looking at causality here. Okay, and we're looking at pointers. We're looking at what these studies essentially will show us is the localization of particular areas of the brain. It'll also show a dichotomy in terms of cases versus controls, and ultimately pathology between cases and controls. Again, that's all it's telling us. But again, when you put these converging lines of evidence, so when you put the fMRI data together with genetic data, so the genetic data will look again, there's certain genes that will encode for variation in these particular brain regions. They're dopamine rich, so you could look at dopamine markers such as the dopamine transporter, which I looked at in my PhD in relation to nicotine and cocaine. You could look at these areas. Of course, there's a commonality, and you might find, going back to the model train, that these individuals will have a variation in their genes compared to controls. Absolutely, it's not specific. And
is it possible? Is it possible, Colin, that variation in the genes, and we know that there is a genetic component to personality, is it possible that variation in the genes maybe predisposes someone to have a very deep interest in a narrow field, and then society or the cultural input there is, or perhaps family formation or whatever it is, then allows, let's say, model railways. God, I'm sorry to all the model railways enthusiasts out there, or whatever particular interest kind of slots into that, and that becomes the object of their predisposition for deep interest in a narrow field.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you're asking about...
And it could have been politics, and somebody could be a politics nerd, or it could have been, Clare minor hurling players and matches, and it could have been anything. But that personality, gets its dopamine hit, let's say, to use a very unscientific term, which I'm sure you'll object to, but gets its dopamine hit from whatever that is. And I guess the question that I'm leading towards there is whether the gambling, and that, as you have described it in scientific tests using the fMRI, is something that is clearly, from a family or a society point of view or an individual point of view, very problematic because people lose a load of money, that it is essentially taking advantage or hijacking or, exploiting those pathways which may or may not exist in other people in non-problematic ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're essentially asking, about the proportionate contribution of genes and environment to the phenotypic, what we call the phenotypic expression of the disorder. So, in other words, how much do genes, specific genes to a specific disorder, contribute to the overall presentation of the illness? So the answer to that is that the genes that contribute to gambling disorder may well contribute to other interests. Okay, so you may, in other words, the genes that will encode for the development of gambling disorder may well, and we feel on the evidence that we have to date that there is significant crossover between not only those genes in other addictions, but also mental health disorders. Okay, so they're not specific. And the other piece, and the heritability coefficient, meaning if you look at twin studies, how much do genes contribute to the development of the overall disorder?
Yes, I'm going to pause you on that because I have been reading about this. I just want to explain what you're talking about, the heritability coefficient. Essentially, with some clever mathematics, you can look at people who are related, particularly who are twins, and you can see what is the likelihood that the two of them end up with any particular genetic trait. And from that likelihood, you can infer the proportion, because it's not 100 versus 0, it's a mix, but you can infer the proportion of any particular effect being from genetics, and by subtraction the proportion of it which is from the environment. I think I'm correct on that. So sorry, go ahead on what you were saying.
Yeah, no, really good. Yeah, really good. So thank you for that. And so in and around 50% for addictive disorders, including gambling disorder. Okay. All right. And then
so
the rest,
that essentially means that if you get twins, all other things being equal, and you have one twin is a gambling addict, the increase in likelihood of the other twin being also a gambling addict indicates that it's about half and half genetics and half environment. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, and extrapolate it out from twins just to the general. If you think of somebody and the chances of them developing, or if they're presenting to you with a gambling disorder, how much influence will genes have had on that condition in that person and many other people? It's approximately 50%. Now, obviously, it'll vary. There'll be an average of 50%, and some people could be much higher, depending on, we think hundreds of genes of small effect contributing to the overall phenotype, and the rest critically is environment. So in Ireland, where we have a normalized, highly proliferated gambling scene and gambling
advertising industry. I want to move on to that in a little while, Con, and I very much want to talk about that. But the reason I was guiding in this direction first was because I have, in various contexts, seen, for example, people who come from families or who in other ways were impacted by alcohol or other types of drugs, people who were essentially the victim of that, that's perhaps not a good way to express it, but not the addict, but the person in the addict's family. And I have seen people, I'm sure it's not a universal feeling, but it certainly exists, of a pushback against the medicalization of some of those addictions. And the phrase, I'm sure everybody will recognize it, said of an alcoholic, the person has a disease. And I'm not qualified to, say yes, I or no to that. But there is quite a distinction, or it's at least, I think, maybe important to understand the distinction between, let's say, somebody getting cancer and somebody being an alcoholic or having some other addiction, in that those kind of very clearly observable physical diseases, there is no element of volition. There is no element of choice. And when someone who has had, another person's addiction impact their life, it can be very upsetting for them to hear of the addict said, well, it's not their fault at all. They're an addict. They have a disease. And to either minimize or maybe even completely eliminate the notion of choice or agency or free will on the part of the addict. And I guess the question that I'm going towards is, do you recognize that there is any, and I can understand, why there's a pushback against the moralistic type of condemnation of addicts, and that's not really helpful to recovery, I would guess. But do you understand why that frame of reference, that way of talking about it, can be upsetting to some people?
Every day of the week.
Mm-hmm.
Every day I deal with families all the time, and we deal with the despair, the heartache, the rage.
Mm-hmm. But all of those happen when somebody you love dies of cancer or is killed in a car crash.
And they also happen when somebody is suffering from addiction.
Yeah. But how do you deal with essentially the fact, and I have heard, and I'm sure you will also have heard the saying or very oft repeated phrase that the addict needs to put a lot of effort into recovery and has to really want to get off and so forth. Is the corollary of that someone who doesn't recover, who keeps gambling, keeps drinking or whatever, is the corollary of that they're either, choice is a difficult element of this, but in some way they are not putting in the effort?
Yeah, of course. I mean, ultimately, you're raising the angst and concern that there is around the disease model, and I'm well aware of the opposition to the disease model, and I'm well aware of the stigma that comes. A lot of the stigma, that
does it have any validity in your opinion?
No,
none
whatsoever.
Okay.
I mean, the disease model is absolutely and utterly clear to me, and I'll tell you why. Because nobody that comes to see me wants to be taking drugs. Nobody wants to be drinking. Once you get to what we call tertiary care here, so they call it tier 4 in the UK.
So in other words, very serious medical intervention.
It's basically people who have suffered for quite some time with a particular addiction. So the hedonistic piece, or the hedonistic early piece, where you get alterations in neural circuitry leading to, sometimes euphoric experience. That can be in gambling in a first win, or it can be when you take drugs initially for a period of time and it's euphoric. Very quickly, that's replaced in those who are problematic with the need to have a same desired effect. Okay, and that is not hedonistic. That is actually to try and feel normal again. It's to normalize neural circuitry that is abnormal.
Colin, forgive me for rephrasing you. Essentially, once you have gotten a kick out of the initial behavior, you are essentially addicted, and you are doing the addictive behavior not to get high, but just to not get low. Am I?
Yeah, correct. This is called a negative reinforcement state. So this is not to take, from the fact either that you have a tranche of people who continue to use drugs within that phase of, like 80% of people will use drugs and not run into a difficulty. So that's similarly with gambling. I'm not suggesting that everybody who gambles or uses drugs ends up becoming negatively reinforced and having to take, the drugs on a regular basis. What I'm saying in terms of addiction, the illness that wreaks havoc and carnage in families and has similar effects, the analogies between gambling and cancer are made all the time. And I'm sure that grates with certain people because they think, well, utter nonsense. This is an issue of willpower. Pull up your socks.
You can be talking about a now adult child who had their entire childhood destroyed, who has been suffering for literally decades. And the other thing that I think grates with people in that particular situation is the degree of praise and positive reinforcement from society for people who are being saying, Jesus, isn't he great? He got off the drink. And somebody is saying, well, I had to put up with him for 30 years.
But let me ask you then, what would be, what's the alternative? Are you should we just round up and punish people and further
I don't know,
stigmatize
Colin.
them.
You're the expert,
That's
not me.
lots of people who are not experts have views in this, and I
That's
end up
true.
having discussions with them about it, and I'm happy to do so
Mm-hmm.
because at the end of the day, we need to hear all voices on this. But look,
Mm-hmm.
I suppose what I would say as a clinician and scientist, I'd say that the evidence, and being a clinician here is important because I deal with, that angst and the rage, and many people that I interact with share the views that you're talking about, which is that
Mm-hmm.
addiction
Mm-hmm.
is not a scientific disorder or illness. It's not a medical illness, and it's weak-willed people who need to pull it together. Now, to be fair, that used to be the case from the 1940s onwards, and it's relatively recent. That, for instance, gambling. It was May to 2014 that it was classified as a illness or an addiction. Prior to that, it was in the classificatory systems in a very vague collection with hair pulling and various other fire setting and various other
Mm-hmm.
compulsive disorders.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really the reason it's sitting alongside drug and alcohol addiction now as an addiction is because of what we said at the top, the converging lines of evidence, clinical results, laboratory tests, genetic tests, and fMRI or neuroimaging, to use the umbrella term. The findings from all of that and from clinicians across the world. And I would add in a little rider as well that people started presenting from Parkinson's clinics.
Yep.
So if you don't believe that, that
We'll
addiction
roll
is
back there. People who are suffering from Parkinson's, which is a degenerative disorder. Am I correct in saying that with Parkinson's, your mind essentially remains clear, but your ability of your mind to control your body is degraded?
Yes, this is an illness characterized by dopamine dysfunction, where you get tremors and motor difficulties, meaning movement difficulties primarily. And what is seen in the general rate when you look at across different populations, you at least settle on 1% for severe gambling disorder of the general population. Okay, so that's actually 3% in Ireland from Pete Lunn's work at the ESRI, which I had campaigned for many years to say that the rate of gambling disorder was much higher, and actually was proven to be so in nearly 3,000 subjects. But anyway, I won't get into that. But
Okay.
the 1%, if we take 1% at the lower level in people with the general population, in people with dopamine dysfunction and Parkinson's disease, the rate of problem gambling is 3 to 6%.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and you might say, well, big deal, so what? If you add in, here we go. Now this is where it gets interesting. If you add in what's called a dopamine agonist to boost the hypodopaminergic state in Parkinson's, meaning the low dopamine causing the motor and tremor difficulties, you get rates of gambling disorder heading 6 to 14%.
Oh, roll back.
Okay?
You're going to have to explain that to me again. So if
okay.
you doping, so are you saying that if you add in giving somebody drug in terms of dopamine in supplementing it?
Yeah. So if you add a typical dopamine treatment drug for Parkinson's called a dopamine agonist, which basically agonistic means it boosts the level at that dopamine receptor.
Yeah.
You then increase the rates of gambling disorder within that population up to 6%, from 6% to 14%. So for dysfunction, you go from 1% in the general population up to 3%, indicating that dopamine, there's a bit of a smoking gun with dopamine. But when you add in a dopamine accelerator or a dopamine booster, up goes the rates of gambling disorder. And this is in people who have never gambled before. This is the initiation.
To understand what you're saying, Colin, because you are very expert, and I don't want to lose the listeners on this. You're essentially saying that some people are being treated for Parkinson's with, are you saying giving them dopamine or giving them an anti-dopamine?
A dopamine agonist, so a drug that will boost their dopamine levels to alleviate the symptoms of Parkinson's disease.
And a side effect of that is to create some people as problematic gamblers who never had a problem with gambling previously. Okay, that's something I was completely unaware of.
And to go back to your point about here comes the train. Again, your restricted interests or other interests, and my suggestion that it's not just specific to particular addictions.
Yeah.
You also see an increase in compulsive shopping and hypersexuality. Okay. Two issues that I won't talk to you today about, but that are trivialized, but in future they won't be trivialized, particularly sex addiction. Okay, because it's a big issue that particularly through device usage, that's going to be very, really, really problematic at the moment.
Is that a polite way of saying people watching porn on their phones?
No, it's porn use, it's webcam usage.
The whole across technology.
It's attendance at sex workers at the click of a button, use of dating sites, and sexual activity on social media platforms. That's just some. I mean, there's a lot more as well. But what I'm saying is that this is a biological model as such of the biological basis of addiction. So those who will say, pull up your socks, this is an issue of will, and I don't care about what, Professor O'Gara says about this, that, or the other, it's all a load of rubbish. Unfortunately, it's not, because we know that the deficits now, if you look here at, there's clearly something going on with the dopamine system, right? And as I've said at the top, between cases and controls, those people who continue to use and cause carnage for their families, they have neural circuitry which is deficient. They have neural circuitry that from birth, the variation they have in their genetic systems and their ability to tolerate certain processes when they initiate those processes, they do not have the brakes to put on that other people do. And therein lies the dis-ease, and therein lies the disorder, and therein lies the medical piece. And these are disabilities. And, ultimately, again, there's a big battleground around, the UK will not recognize addiction as a disability, whereas in the United States, they do. The UN Convention recognizes addiction and mental health difficulties as disabilities from the UN Convention in 2021.
Okay,
it's a little bit all over the place, but that mirrors the divisive nature of that. Is what is still a debate, I guess. But in terms of the science and the medical, there is no debate.
And your view on that debate is very clear, and you have that grounded in science and qualifications, which I certainly don't. And that is.
But I'm still trying to persuade people, William, and I get
absolutely,
that,
and validly so.
And this is partly why I do these. I mean, it's probably one of the biggest driving factor as to why I will take part. People wonder why I do this and maybe other interviews and whatever. It's for that reason,
and get punched around a bit once in a while in an interview. And I don't want to do that, but I want to make sure that I ask the questions that people that people are asking. And I guess the question that follows on from that, and you have, as well as given your view very clearly, you've acknowledged that there does exist a debate. You're not undermining the validity of what other people say who you might disagree with what they say, but you're not undermining the validity of that, and I think that's valuable. I think it's probably, if you go on social media, especially social media oriented towards younger people, it will be very difficult to miss a strong trend of medicalizing a large number of effects or phenomena that might just have been seen as personality traits a short time ago. And there's certainly a very significant trend of what's called self-diagnosis, in which some cases other people would just say making up symptoms and claiming to have one disorder or the other. So the two parallel questions I have: would you agree that at least to some extent there's just an awful lot of nonsense being talked on social media about that? And given that, is that harmful, and does that make it difficult, given that there are some people who are obviously talking nonsense, does that make it more difficult for you to make the case that you're making?
Which disorders are you talking about specifically,
There,
though?
there are
Because
there
just
are
to,
trends on social media, and it depends on what subculture you go into. But there are trends on social media for people quite clearly to pretend that they have multiple personality disorder, and these are people who have never seen a doctor for any of these,
right, okay.
and to say that they
I
have a
mean,
whole series of other
okay,
quite unusual
yeah,
psychological or psychiatric illnesses, and
yeah.
there's simply no question that
Oh, yeah,
a
yeah,
significant degree of this is attention-seeking behavior.
sure. Well, yeah, look, whatever about the individuals and their motivations to do that, I think you're really what you're reflecting is the lack of regulation and fact checking. And, if that is, I mean, if that has no effect on other people, fair enough. I mean, let people do whatever they want to do. I don't care what they do. But I mean, if that is affecting either a child or an adolescent, in terms of, it has a deleterious effect on their mental health, well, then that's a serious issue. And of course, this is, in terms of the, tech and the ability of certain messaging to go out that's clearly harmful for children. I mean, it's completely unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
Unacceptable on absolutely,
Okay.
as far as
Okay.
I'm concerned.
I said I would come back to it, and I do, and I will now, because there is, of course, the gambling industry, and this is a huge industry, and it is wildly profitable, and it is able to, how do I put it? It is able to advertise itself. And I was looking before we started recording at some of the statistics around alcohol, and it was very notable. And these are British figures reported in the Guardian, but I think Irish figures would not be that different. That 20% of the population account for 70% of all alcohol sales, and within that, just 4% of the population account for a quarter of all alcohol sales. So, in other words, the alcohol industry is very heavily dependent on alcoholics. And that industry just would not be viable without the existence of alcoholics, even if most people who drink just have, the odd social drink whenever. Is that the case? And I'm sure you're aware of the spread of what proportion of gamblers contribute to what proportion of the profits of the industry. And if problem gamblers, people who are clearly gambling addicts, if they were all cured overnight, would the industry still be viable?
Well, there's various figures touted in terms of the percentage yield that comes from problem gamblers, 60%, 70%, 80%. And again, how do you define a problem gambler there? Has PGSI been used? So there are various studies, or not even studies, reports that come out to indicate that. I think what's very clear, and which you find it very difficult to argue against, William, is that a disproportionate yield, just like the figures you've outlined with alcohol, comes from problem gambling, and it's probably the lion's share comes from problem gamblers. So really, that's a very uncomfortable vista really for the industry, in terms of where they go. And this is why to date there has been resistance, and there will be continue to be resistance to measures that will hamper profit.
I'll come to the measures, but I just want to kind of get your sort of feeling when you hear stories about, for example, don't particularly want to name them, but whatever gambling company treating their top customers, so to speak, to huge amounts of treats, and like flying them around the place and giving all of these sort of clearly expensive but non-cash perks to them. How do you feel?
Well, I mean, the question for me is, should these things be legal or not? And I think inducements of any type should not be allowed. How do I feel? Well, as a clinician, if that person ends up in big trouble as a result of those inducements, well, then I feel, despair for the situation, frankly, and I think it needs to be improved. So I think, the hopefully we're almost there, William, in terms of the gambling bill in Ireland. So I look forward, and in fact, the establishment of the Gambling Regulatory Authority of Ireland under the stewardship of Anne-Marie Caulfield and her team, who I've had the pleasure of meeting. I think we're in a new space now. I think we have, after many decades, we have a starting point in terms of regulation. We have a minister who has pushed back against very intense lobbying in the last few
Who's
months.
this?
Minister James Brown.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's done he did a wonderful job in terms of carrying the legislation through, and I think he stood firm when he needed to on the big ticket items in terms of advertising and exposure of adolescents to hundreds of ads a year, really, which is essentially an incredibly incredible situation that we got in Ireland, that you couldn't watch sport without being bombarded with gambling ads.
Mm-hmm.
And he's also mandated the establishment of gambling for office control, an office for gambling control in Ireland now.
Yep.
So we've moved along. It is all slow though. I mean,
but to relate that to a question that I put previously, which is what I was kind of trying to set up, and you've got there for me. If, let's say, there exists a predisposition to, let's say, having a deep interest in a narrow topic, for example, and that might be a partially or indeed wholly genetic effect. Mm-hmm. With the type of gambling advertising that has existed, at least up to now, would you think that essentially what the gambling industry, and I use that word loosely, what the gambling industry is doing is trying to insert a nudge towards gambling at a time when a young person who might have just a predisposition to having a deep interest in something is about to land on what that particular thing they're going to be interested in is?
Look, possibly. I think you have a listed company, you've got shareholders, and the industry will say they're advertising to maximize their profits. Whether and of course, industry, to be fair, will also say that they've initiated a number of gambling, safe gambling practices and responsible gambling initiatives to help the individual. Whether they are, it's very clear the slot machines, for instance, a lot of work has gone into slot machines over the years in terms of making them maximally addictive. And online slots are probably the crack cocaine version of actual slots, because they're that bit more immediate. Very similar to what are fixed odds betting terms, FOBTs, which were the electronic gaming machines, or EGMs in the UK, that would take in a housing estate a economically disadvantaged area in the UK, and somebody could lose their weekly or monthly salary within a half an hour. I mean, that's just soul destroying stuff. So
I'm going to push back at your line, not your line, the line that you quoted from the gambling industry. That was also the same line given by the tobacco industry when they were defending advertising of smoking, and they said that their ads were not intended at all to try and convince anyone to start smoking. They were just targeting the switchers and trying to get a smoker to switch from one brand to another. And somebody sat down and was able to do the figures and count how much money was being spent on cigarette advertising and how many smokers switched brand in any given period. And it was blindingly obvious that the cigarette industry was lying, and that the amount that they spent on advertising was a vast multiple of what could be justified by the potential number of brand switchers, of getting smokers to switch from one brand to another. It just wasn't credible. Not aware if the same analysis has been done of advertising for gambling, but is your sense that the defense of the advertising gambling is equally lacks credibility?
Well, I think the extent to which advertising has taken over the sport in particular is blindingly obvious for all to see. I mean, it's you couldn't sit down, and this is children at daytime could not sit down without being bombarded. Meaning, and the word bombarded means that it was just it's literally incessant. And the Premiership shirt this is going to be, banned basically in 2 or 3 years' time in the UK. And notwithstanding those restrictions that are about to come in, the actual numbers of shirts that have betting companies on them have actually increased in the last year. So all the while you're pushing back here against a big machine, a one with big energy behind it to try and get out this product over another product. Remember, it's a competitive space for that industry as well. So they're fighting for a particular market. But I mean, the end result is that the poor punter at the end of it, or the poor prospective person who's going to develop gambling disorder, is utterly defenseless. So it's up to policymakers and then people like myself who provide treatment, is to try and push back against this tsunami, really, of advertising coming one direction. And it does feel like that sometimes, I have to say. It's that it's a real, you really are up against a behemoth of effort on the other side. And there might be, there's a few voices on the other side. But again, I'm pleased that I have to say, nervous coming up in the last few months in terms of what would actually happen in terms of the bill. And it looks like at the final hurdle, to use that unfortunate term, that Minister Brown has stood his ground. And he, on the big issues, we don't have time
give me
to
the
go
headlines
today, but I mean, well, in terms of, certain
advertising you mentioned,
broadcasters not being able to broadcast because they'd lose too much money. And, there was various arguments put forward. And,
but give me the headlines of what's covered in the bill that you like.
Well, if for listeners who are interested, we released as part of with colleagues from the Irish College of Psychiatrists, put out a position paper. If you put in position paper gambling, put in my name, you'll get up what our kind of shopping list, wish list, I suppose.
Yeah,
I mean,
give me the headlines.
There's going to be no advertising.
Yeah.
From 5 a.m. till 9 p.m, which is a good start. I mean, that's going to be very important. So that's going to come through. The next piece is we're going to finally have a social fund, which we'll be able to look at starting to provide some treatment services in Ireland.
So this is essentially the gambling companies will fund this to provide treatment.
Well, will they? You see, this is
the
devil's in the detail here, and for Anne-Marie Caulfield and her colleagues in the GRAI, this is exactly what they will have to focus on. I have proposed a 1% levy in the past. I don't think that's going to be sufficient. I think it needs to be much higher, and I think it's going to be very painful proposition for the industry, and of course it'll be resisted, and hopefully won't go on for years. But ultimately, people need to be treated for this condition, and it needs to be funded by the industry. And I think we need not only inpatient facilities, but we need a network of outpatient facilities across the country, with facilities like debt management, associations with the likes of MABs, one-to-one counselling, group therapy, family. You've alluded to the family impact on the family, family therapy. And there's a whole host. The literature suggests not one individual, William, is affected by gambling disorder, 7 or 8 individuals around the person, often with those people holding the views that the person needs to pull up their socks and, for God's sake, stop torturing the rest of the family, because really it's all within their will. And that's
Colin, because I'm conscious that we have gone on for a long time. If you were to do a Trump and be a dictator for one day, what reform would you bring in?
What would I bring in?
Mm-hmm. What reform or what law would you bring in to control gambling?
Well, look, I think what
would you abolish the lot?
It's not at all. No, I mean, you can't abolish anything nowadays, because it will go underground, and it'll probably be in a worse form than it was. But I mean, again, that's an argument used by the industry in a different guise, but around regulation. But we certainly need regulation. Banning something isn't going to work, but we need regulation. And I think if I was Kamala Harris for a day, I would look at the levy. I would ask my talented team to cost up the cost of 4 inpatient treatment centres across the island of Ireland in each province, inpatient. I think that's very reasonable. I don't think I'm off the wall here. And
Can I suggest? Can I ask about one other thing, which I think is not included in the bill or not really discussed? You may or may not be aware of. In the Odyssey, there is the sirens, which is where the word comes from, are these singers who attract sailors to sail their ship onto the rocks, and Odysseus manages to avoid this by having his crew tied up to the masts so they're physically unable to be lured by the sirens and crash their ship.
Right.
And an analogous proposal for gambling is to say that somebody should be allowed to notify, perhaps centrally through a single portal, anyone who provides gambling and say, this is me, this is my PPSN number, or whatever I identify myself. I don't want to be allowed to gamble, and I have to give 6 months' notice in order to remove this, so that they are essentially voluntarily banning themselves, and then you require any provider of gambling to follow that and to check it up, and with the penalty that if they don't respect it, they take a financial hit. They cannot collect on that. Is that something that you think is either possible or desirable?
What's happening?
And how thorough will that be?
I think it'll be where there's a national exclusion register currently. The GRAI are looking at that at the moment. So that is.
And you think it will happen?
Oh no, that is happening.
It will.
That is happening. And that is happening. So the provision will be there for that. What do I think? Is it a silver bullet, William? No. Like the people, gamblers themselves have self-excluded for donkey's years, but it hasn't been, you can just go to other providers, so it's not national. But I mean, you can be on a national exclusion register, but you'll go online and find a weird and wonderful site somewhere operating out of Malta or wherever, but it's online. So it's the online space is incredibly difficult, so it's multimodal treatment. I mean, the National Exclusion Register will help, but again, it's not a silver bullet. But if you're at the same time using software like Gamban, which which will be quite helpful on your phone, so you're not getting onto the online ones, you're seeing a one-to-one therapist, they're helping you with cravings and triggers, and you're also going to GA meetings, and you're linking in with the fellowship there, and you're looking after your self-care and you're doing your best. I mean, there is no single. Sorry, I should have said if you're using other substances as well, that you keep that under control. There isn't a silver bullet, but if you do all of the above, you have a very good chance of recovering, in my view.
Professor Colin O'Gara, the consultant psychiatrist and head of addiction services at St. John of God's Hospital, also the author of books about recovering from gambling. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you, William. Thanks for having me on.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter @Here's How Podcast, and get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. It covers the cost of keeping the podcast going, phone bills and web hosting and that. And if you could throw in a couple of euro once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/Here's How. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.